Kind of sticking with this whole theme of, what if? What if we can look at all of this in the context of time? How does that relate to origins, intent, and this question of friend versus foe, which again is kind of more of the focus of the symposium in Cincinnati coming up in August of this year. Show of hands, how many of you will be attending that? All right, there's some people. I look forward to seeing you there as well. And that will be more of the focus of that particular talk, and we'll talk about a number of cases that aren't published yet that I think really kind of get at this question of what types of interactions are we dealing with, and how do we interpret the valence of those interactions, that aspect of is it friendly or is it more negative? But I think at the heart of that, again, is the question of origins, and we would expect, again, it's somewhat speculative, because how can anyone get in the minds of future humans or extraterrestrials, whatever their origins may be, but if they are us, if they are humans, if we can make that assumption for now, we would expect the interaction to be more friendly. Simply because we do have shared species status, that we are conspecifics is the fancy word we use for that. This means members of the same species, essentially. And we may be able to kind of think of this in the context of what we do to other animals. What's our relationship with other animals on this planet and our relationship with ourselves, with other humans. And obviously the ones that are more closely related to us, things like chimpanzees, the great apes in general, who we share a common ancestor with chimps in particular about 6 to 8 million years ago. With gorillas, it's about 8 to 10 million years ago. And that's really where our branches split, where we started to go on these separate paths to becoming modern humans, modern gorillas, modern chimpanzees. But in 29 countries, they've recently banned, mostly Western developed nations, they've banned any sort of testing on hominoids, the great apes, simply because we see that relationship with them. We see more of ourselves in them. So in the context of origins, it's hard to think why extraterrestrials who see nothing of themselves in us might treat us in somewhat benevolent ways. And there's a number of cases where that's clearly demonstrated, that they care for us and they take care of us both in their captivity and even those that witness many of these accounts and try to limit the effects of those interactions with them. So I think that's important to consider. Obviously, I talked at the beginning of this presentation about taking care of the earth, show concern for abductees, the ones that are actually taken into these ships or contacted in various ways. In Cincinnati, I'll talk about a number of instances of those. The title of my presentation there was Friend, ? Because there's obviously things that we need to consider that aren't necessarily nice actions. And then I'll talk about more of the morality issues. Is the paranormal, paramoral, I think is sort of the main focus of that. But it's not just the abductees, the witnesses. There's a number of cases where people will be taken, the witnesses are freaking out, and then they'll bring that individual back, even if much more time has passed for that individual. I talk about 2 cases that highlight this in my most recent book. The case of Amy Rylance in Australia and the case of Corporal Armando Valdez in Chile. In both cases, the people who watched them be taken into the proximity or actually into this craft perceived the flow of time differently relative to those individuals that were inside. For instance, with Corporal Armando Valdez, many of you are probably familiar with this case, his watch read 5 days in the future. He was very malnourished, dehydrated, but only 15 minutes passed for his men in his platoon outside that sphere of influence, as Jim Peniston calls it. And then with Amy Rylance, she had disappeared for only about an hour and a half, but she recounts being gone for upwards of 5 to 7 days. So cases like that seem to indicate that there is some sort of concern, not just for the individual. And with Amy Rylance specifically, she described being with a man, a human man, same proportions, and said they treated her great. She actually enjoyed her experience. And you do see that in a number of other cases as well, but again, we can't just look at the whole phenomenon with rose-colored glasses. There's obviously more going on than that. And a lot of people do have traumatic experiences, which we'll circle back to in a second here. So with regard to origins, I've kind of touched on this already, but it is improbable that other life forms would evolve in the same way on other planets, but also importantly at the same time. This isn't something that I talked about earlier, but we have to remember that we're not just talking about that planet over there and this planet over here right now. The Earth has been here for 4.5 billion years, the universe for 14 billion years. So when we start thinking about the probability that we would get upright walking hominins evolving on both of those planets that happen to be close enough that we could find each other and travel to and between these planets, but also at the same time that we both exist now, but they happen to be slightly more advanced than us. It adds another layer of probability in there that makes it less likely. If we do take serious these accounts of hybridization, and I think there is ample reasons to take those seriously, it's very commonly described in a number of different cases. The Travis Walton case, where he initially woke up to the more gray, short gray type beings, but then was intervened in the control room by the more modern human-looking man who had very similar characteristics to another male and I think a female or two. Could be the result of this breeding program or something else could be going on there. But if we do take this seriously, by definition, based on the biological species classification system, which is the oldest way that we understand familial relationships. It's what Carlos Linnaeus was doing, John Ray, Cuvier, Buffon, all of these early European taxonomists, as they were just taking two organisms, and if they could reproduce and produce viable offspring, then we considered them the same species. So if we can reproduce with these beings, these visitors, and produce viable offspring, by definition, based on the species, biological species classification system, then we would consider ourselves the same species. They can breathe our air, which is important. Maybe not the case if they evolved on a different planet with different atmosphere. Demonstrated ability to manipulate space-time in and around the craft. Missing time, temporal divergence. Another study was done recently that showed, circling back to Travis Walton, that the trees around that area where he was taken grew at a faster rate than the trees farther away. The case of Linda Jones in my second book, where time was skewed. She was seeing men in fedoras running. I was just having a conversation with a gentleman down here at the break where she got glimpses into the past. Like in the proximity of this craft, time was sort of melded or switched around or confused, where she was seeing individuals from the past who were there in that same place, who probably in the past were freaking out, like what the hell's going on, who weren't a part of that UFO encounter. But a number of instances like that. Also in Linda Jones, she was being followed by this craft and described the grass under her feet growing at a tremendous speed, like 5 feet. Freshly mowed grass growing at 5 feet under her feet. Jim Penniston, the sphere of influence, time and space changed around that. But I do think it's also important to consider, which I mentioned briefly before, in the context of these accelerations and decelerations, these insane g-forces. They calculated with that tic-tac study done by Kevin Knuth and a number of other physicists. The SCU, Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, also did a similar study where they can take the actual readings from radar and calculate the trajectory, the speed of these craft, and also the g-forces that would be expected to be experienced in association with that. And it was upward of 10,000 g-forces. Then the obvious question is, well, what would that do to any living organism inside of that machine? But if we think about, again, the sphere of influence, where what they're experiencing inside that, if they are manipulating the space-time metric, then they're not experiencing the flow of time in the same way that we do outside of it. So we see this incredibly fast acceleration, deceleration, instantaneous 90-degree turn and think, well, how could anybody survive that if they are inside? But what they may be experiencing inside that craft, if they are manipulating the space-time metric, is likely to be something much more normal, certainly something that wouldn't smash them against the inside of the ship. Maybe they feel 1G, maybe they feel nothing at all if they're able to manipulate that movement completely out of it by messing with the space-time metric. So I think there's a lot of things related to the behaviors of the craft, the way time passes in and around it. If that is the case, it also might help explain why it's so hard to shoot them down. I think we can all agree that the things we did actually shoot down were not UFOs in the typical sense of the word. I believe the consensus now is that they were Chinese spy balloons. But if you're slowing down everything outside of your ship, where we see it moving tremendously fast, what they likely see, even if we shoot a missile at them or a bullet traveling at some 700 miles per hour, they might see that coming at a snail's pace, which would make it almost impossible to shoot them down. It would also make what they do, how they travel, if they are trying to avoid us seeing them most of the time. Clearly they want us to see them some of the time. They don't hide their existence very well at all. But it would really give them safety, not just from our missiles and bullets and things, but also to move around. Like Shane just showed me a picture of a craft that was 75 frames per second or something like that. And it caught it in one of those frames. It was clearly traveling at tremendous speed. And we just don't see it. We don't live in that speed of life. So we are completely unaware of this. They could be traveling around all around us and see us moving incredibly slowly, and we barely see them at all just because we can't register speeds like that. Another thing that is important to consider is that these abductions seem to mimic biomedical research, exactly what I would do as a paleoanthropologist, a biological anthropologist, if I had access to time travel technology. I would be examining teeth and skin and taking samples of blood, hair, gametes, which is so ubiquitous in these cases. The fecal extractions, you can learn a lot about poop. A lot of people don't realize that, but when we find coprolites, when we find poop, dried poop in caves, I could probably stop saying poop now, it is a super fun word, but when we find fecal matter in caves, it reveals so much about the diet of the individuals that laid that turd down. For instance, with Neanderthals, we found a coprolite in one cave and found out that they consume about 7,000 calories per day, and mostly meat, because that was what was most prolific in their environment. So just that anal probe aspect that we focused on so much and was the focus of, I think, the very first South Park episode, is very important, and you could understand why they would do that, and I might do that too. Sounds kind of gross, but you do get a lot of information, and it might be worth doing. And then another interesting one that often gets overlooked, but you see this pattern across various cases, is that you have instances of lifelong interaction with these beings, these visitors, where the same individual interacts with the same people, you could argue, across their entire life, but they never age. Meanwhile, these kids who are first contacted, sometimes 6, 7, usually around age 8, which also happens to be the age, I looked this up in Spain recently. I think I was walking by like a church and we were talking about First Communion, but I looked it up and it said that's the age that the Catholic Church deemed to be when logic forms, or when you have the ability to reason logically. So I think it is interesting that a lot of people who come into this, and when it started as small kids, it happens to be around that same age. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not, but from that point, as a small child to becoming an aged adult, they don't age. And it's interesting to flip that and think about what that might look like to them. I talk about this in my second book a good deal, where they could be doing this longitudinal research study and coming back to what I was talking about with them doing what I would do as a paleoanthropologist. Longitudinal research is one of the best ways to get knowledge about anything. Studying the same individual or the same group of organisms over long periods of time. It's difficult to do because you need funding throughout a very long period of time. It's slow. You don't get publication results until the very end of it. So we usually don't do it. We do cross-sectional research. But if you had the ability to do this with the aid of a time machine, you could pick up that 8-year-old kid, do all of these studies, drop them back off, tuck them into bed, 20 minutes later, you go and pick them up at age 12, again at age 20, again at age 30, and you get that longitudinal data, which to them feels like an entire lifetime. To you, as the researcher, could take place in 2 or 3 days, depending on how you structured your workday. So I think it's important with a lot of these things to kind of look at what we see, what these people report, and how that might look, not just for us as the research subject, but for the researchers as well. And then the main thing that brought me into this, and kind of the main focus of my first book, were these long-term evolutionary trends in hominin anatomy. How our morphology changed over the course of the 6 to 8 million years since we became upright walking hominins. And there's a very strong correlation between what happens in our evolutionary past and what we see in the context of what I argue are future humans, because they do possess a physiological form that's completely in line with what we would expect to see, regardless of what happens between now and then. A lot of people like to say, well, you know, the grays must mean that we went up into space or we went underground, and then our eyes got bigger because there's low light, and our skin got gray because it wasn't exposed to the sun. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know what happens between now and then, but I do know that we can identify these very clear evolutionary trends that exist throughout this long period of our history as hominins. And a lot of that really comes down to becoming bipedal. We stood upright, and in doing so, our heads had to rotate down so we could see where we're going. So our visual plane is running parallel to the horizon. And as that happened, it flexed our basicranium. And that's the main area at the top of your skull where your brain sits. There's the anterior, the middle, and the posterior cranial base. So as that happened, as that cranial basal flexion occurred, it opened up all of this space in the top of our skulls, our calvarium or our neurocranium, where a bigger brain could grow. And a lot of other changes were taking place primarily, first off, in our postcranial anatomy. But as far as the way that upright walking affected our craniofacial form, it was extremely impactful and continues to be. We suffer from a lot of problems that result from the fact that we have these runaway brains that just took over our whole skulls. A lot of problems with sleep apnea, choking. We're the only mammal that chokes simply because we have a 90-degree angle in our throat, our esophagus. But it also conferred some benefits. The reason I can even talk to you, or we can talk to each other, or you to me, is because of that. Our larynx descended as a result of that rotation and allows us to form far more sounds than we could with a more linear vocal tract anatomy, which is what we see in quadrupeds. So there's benefits, there's also costs. I mentioned some other downsides of bipedalism that have to do with gravity, but a lot of things were happening in our craniofacial anatomy too, and that is, again, the most dominant trend throughout human evolution, that we start with a low-sloping forehead and a projecting face, what we call facial prognathism. It sticks out. I also made a comparison in my first book with domesticated dogs. We tended to do that with dogs to make them cuter. More paedomorphic is the term we use. They retain more juvenilized traits into adulthood. And we did that on purpose. We bred them that way, cute little purse dogs. But the same thing happened to us, is that we retain more childlike traits over evolutionary time, which helps contribute to this big round head and the small face and the pointy chin. So that is by far the most overt and obvious change. If we go from our early hominin ancestors, you see that low sloping forehead, like what you would get to carry the dog analogy forward, like a Doberman Pinscher or a Collie or something like that. The brain starts to grow over top of the eyes. Again, we're the only mammal with that craniofacial configuration in modern humans. And as a result, the face has less time and less space to develop. So it gets kind of the short end of the stick. We've traded brains for big chewing muscles and big teeth. We shrunk this down, our brain got bigger. Tools helped with that, fire, we can start to process our food. So we externalized chewing through the process of cooking, and also helped our gut shrink down from fire, from cooking food. So culture plays a part in this too. They're actually inseparable in what we call biocultural evolution. But just focusing on that trend alone, you can really clearly see how if you projected that forward, you would start to get something with an even bigger, broader head and a smaller face, which again, you add enough time to that and you got yourself a gray alien. So if any of you have been to one of my talks before, you probably remember this slide. I think it's a good way of sort of summarizing just how similar we are to the most commonly described beings seen in association with UFOs. And, you know, obviously we have the cockpit videos, we've got the radar data, and those are important. But that can't be the only thing we talk about. We should also be talking about what people see, what people's experiences are, what they come into contact with. And I think that's starting to happen more and more, and it's extremely important. It takes a lot of bravery to talk about these things. I actually dedicated my last book to the brave women and men who openly talk about this. None of us could move the ball forward without that open, honest conversation. But what people do report seeing most often are four-limbed creatures, tetrapods. Tetrapods go back about 400 million years and is the main characteristic of even whales and bats and highly divergent animals, but we all have that same common ancestor. All tetrapods can trace their ancestry back to 400 million years ago. Could have very easily been something different. We could have all had 6 or 12 or 15, and we do see that with insects and spiders and things like that. But we have 4, and a lot of these other animals do, and the visitors, whatever you want to call them, also do in almost every case I've ever seen. Pentadactyly is another one that you see among tetrapods, even if they don't outwardly have 5 digits on their hands and feet. That other one's in there somewhere. It got absorbed to do something based on the function. Form follows function, so if they're running on hoofs or if they're climbing in trees, you're going to have those 5 digits get reformed for that specific function. And then the bipedalism. This is, you know, the main thing in my mind. If they weren't upright walking hominin forms, if what we were seeing coming out of these crafts looked like a cuttlefish or, you know, some little rat creature, never would have gotten interested in this in the first place. But this is the trait that defines the hominid lineage, bipedalism. As I mentioned in the first part of the talk, it's extremely rare on this planet, and based on what we know of exoplanets and their size and mass and gravity, it's likely to be even rarer on those Earth-like exoplanets. The encephalization, the cranioglobularity, that's just a big fancy word for big round heads. That's one of the traits that defines the modern human lineage. We also have a chin, and those are related. Again, head grows out, face shrinks back, and it shrunk to the point that we have a chin, what's known as a mental eminence. Again, long-term evolutionary trends. Head gets big, face gets small. One that's a little more esoteric that I won't get into too much here, but is the kind of main area of my non-UFO research, has to do with how that affects vision. How does a big expanding brain going out over top of the eyes, as the face shrinks and retracts back under it, affect our vision in a functional sense? And I proposed back in 2012, published a paper in the journal Medical Hypotheses about the fact that it is likely to result in exactly what we see in individuals that develop juvenile onset myopia, nearsightedness, which is the most common visual defect. Those that have even a more extreme version of that craniofacial shape in Southeast Asia, for instance, have rates of myopia that are upwards of 90%. So it affects almost everybody in those populations and is very likely related to the craniofacial form in those populations. The eyes also get bigger in association with brain growth. It's what's called a pleiotropic gene relationship. I will not bore you with that right now. I did mention briefly the paedomorphosis, making cute little dogs. We are doing the same thing. It's been an evolutionary trend where we look more like the children of our ancestors into adulthood. We just retain more of those traits. So If we continue with that trend, you could look at a 2, 3-year-old right now and get some glimpse into what will look like further down the road in our evolutionary future, simply because that is a dominant trend throughout hominin evolution. But beyond the physiological, the morphological stuff, we also seemingly have a number of shared cultural characteristics, technological characteristics, things we have now that they also seem to have. I mentioned the bathrooms and the kitchens that are commonly seen in these craft. A sort of weird one, I don't know if I've ever said this on stage, so it's going to be a little weird for me, like a semen ejaculator machine thing. Anybody seen that? It was on the news a couple years ago. In some Chinese hospital, they automated the whole process of collecting semen. But if there's one thing that's described most in UFO abductions, it's probably that semen extraction for men. But the fact that we already have that, again, is one of those things that may link our present to our future. Ability to communicate in our languages, skipped over that one. That's also important. It may be difficult to learn the language of another group that lives on a different planet based on what sorts of information you can get and the speed of light limitation. But learning the languages of the past, especially with the aid of a time machine, would give you an ability to more easily learn the symbolic language of any number of groups spread throughout your own past. So obviously exceptions exist. It's not all hominin forms, though as we'll see in a second, that is the majority of them. We do also have to consider the other things people see. And they do describe more reptile-like beings, more insect-like beings. But again, we have to break that down. Even if they have a praying mantis-like head, because of their huge eyes and their small face, which again we might expect to see in the very distant human future, how many legs do they have? How many arms do they have? Do they have 4 or 6? Insects have 6. Tetrapods have 4. So I think that also needs to be taken into account when we're starting to ascribe insect-like qualities to these individuals. If they have 6, maybe they come from a very distant time that humans are gone and they figure out time travel technology, and we have actual bugs time traveling and abducting us. But from my understanding, they are still described as having 4 limbs, just with very divergent craniofacial form that makes them look more insect-like. So that's a possibility, but it's not necessarily something that I subscribe to, but I always try to keep everything on the table. But importantly, with these exceptions, we have to take everything into account. We can't just cherry pick. We can't use selection and confirmation bias. It's one of the main things we try to avoid in any sort of scientific understanding. And even though there are problems with surveys and survey results, they can also be extremely informative. Most of the problems come down to, again, selection bias, sample bias, people not being truthful in reporting. But I do get the sense, and this is just me, my own personal opinion, but I do get the sense that people who have had an experience want to be as honest with themselves as they can about it, to understand it. And people that are trying to understand it, you would think, again, just my opinion, that they would want to be as honest with those people as they can too, because the results of their study will help them get information about what happened to them. And I think one of the best studies, many of you are probably familiar with this, Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into I'm not going to read all that, free. It's the reason they called it free, is a massive multi-language, multinational survey and analysis of the survey results. At the time that their first book was published, a massive volume of their results, I think it was around 2019, they had 3,256 individuals as part of the study. I talked to Ray Hernandez, who's the editor of this last year, I think it was. He said it's well over 5,000 now, so it'll be interesting to see how those results change or if they stay consistent, which also might help, circling back, help us understand, what is changing. Are people being more honest? Are they getting better results, more representative results? So change in these results is almost as informative as what you actually see at any given time. So one that's interesting in the context of what we're seeing, or what the most common form is that we're seeing, is that they asked people, do you believe you observed a physical non-human intelligence, NHI? And I could go on a long tangent about how we should stop saying extraterrestrial for everything and stop saying non-human intelligence for everything, because they very well could be human or from this planet and not extraterrestrial, but I digress. But what is important here in the context of bias is that they did bias the question by specifically stating non-human intelligence. You wouldn't want to do that. You'd want to keep it more vague to really adhere to strict survey methodological principles. But despite that, even though they did put non-human intelligence in there, the most commonly described form among the 1,500 individuals who answered in the affirmative to that question, 52% of them were described as human-looking. And you see that across a number of cases, not just the ones, these are ones that I highlighted in my book, where they're talking about humans, just like us, look like us, talk like us, exercise, have bathrooms, all the things I mentioned previously. The jumpsuits, the lycra, spandex, or coverall, one-piece coveralls are also extremely ubiquitous. A number of them, the Dworshak boys, for instance, Antonio Villas-Boas, were subjected to a sort of cleansing process, a decontamination, which again is something I overlooked in my first book, that disease transmission aspect, because you do transmit diseases more easily with conspecifics, members of the same species. But all of these individuals describe seeing entirely human beings. Whitley Strieber interacted with 4 different types that he described, but the ones who gave him the implant in his ear, which is pretty well documented and known about, were entirely human. He said they were just like us. So obviously, that's getting into anecdote a little bit more when you just talk about specific cases like that. But when you look at this in the context of these survey results, you do start to notice a pattern, and that pattern seems to indicate that they are mostly human, just like us. So what does that mean? How do you interpret that? The way I look at it is sort of analogous to geographic proximity. So why would we see humans more often than we would see these grays, or these more divergent forms in the context of temporal ancestry? And I sort of look at this more recently, where if we can look at it with geography, if we can look at it in space, we can sort of use that as a metaphor for time. And what I'm getting at is that the people you interact with the most are the ones that live closest to you. So you see your neighbors more often. You see people in Phoenix, if you're from here, more often than you do people who live in Mongolia or southern France, simply because you're closer to them. As you get farther away, now here in Phoenix, we become a little blip across the entire space that is this globe. And the same thing might apply in the context of this temporal variation, where once you start talking about beings from tens of thousands of years in the future, the likelihood of them happening to stop right here where we are in this time becomes much smaller. But we would expect to see individuals closer to our time more often, and therefore we would expect them to have more modern human-like characteristics simply because they occupy a space that's closer to us in the context of temporal proximity. So after human looking, what we see is that the short grays were the next most commonly reported, 51%, the tall grays at 33%, and then hybrids at 26%. And if you're wondering why these don't add up to 100, it's because a lot of people saw these different types in the same craft. So they're reporting a number of different beings all seen working together inside these ships. And there's numerous cases like that. Again, Whitley Strieber, Terry Lovelace, the one I mentioned earlier with Travis Walton, the different forms he saw. But breaking that down, the most important thing to consider here is that all of these, the 4 most commonly described beings, are all bipedal humans, hominins. They have all of these shared derived characteristics, what we call synapomorphies or homologies, homologous traits. So again, if we're talking about weird squid monsters or some sort of octopus-like thing, I don't think I would even be here talking to you. But because they are so commonly described as hominin, I think it's important to acknowledge those shared characteristics. So only about 5% reported seeing an actual non-human form. The more reptile-like ones, spirits, apparitions, things like that. So certainly important to consider, and again, may indicate that there's a lot of different things going on. Maybe extraterrestrial is a part of this, and they have those traits because they did have a separate evolutionary trajectory. But as in the context of the valence of this, and again, this will be more of the focus at the symposium in Cincinnati, is that the ones who interacted with the more human-like types reported having a positive or neutral experience. Also importantly, and Ray Hernandez points this out all the time, is with repeated contact, as people started to interact with them more, that number goes up tremendously. So only about 5%, even though this is how these alien abductions have been portrayed in various forms of media, TV shows, films, obviously, where it's a really horrific experience. Someone's ripped out of bed and this monster, like green alien, takes them up into their ship and sticks things in their butts. That's obviously a part of it, but it's a small part of it. And a lot of that does have to do with the ontological shock that comes with being taken out of your bed in the middle of the night. I don't care if it's your neighbor. They come over and take you out of your bed in the middle of the night, you're going to be like, what the hell? What's going on here? But if it's something that looks like you but doesn't look like you, and they have this crazy technology and they can make your body stay paralyzed as they fly you around through the walls, like that's going to freak you out. But the more time you have to really focus on that, and if it happens again, now it's a little more normal. It doesn't matter where you go or what you're doing. I was just having a conversation with Stacy on the way over here about how I worked in South Africa at this 3.5 million year Australopithecus africanus site, and we drank out of a creek. We didn't have electricity. And that seemed insane at first, but then by the time I came home, I was just obsessed with light switches, just the ease of turning that on and off. Humans are extremely adaptable creatures. We have to be, because we adapt with our culture and our intellect. So it makes sense why the more often these things happen, if you're not harmed and you show up back in bed, you're like, well, all right, I guess that went okay. My butt's a little sore, but I mean, I'm not dead, so that's good. And then you start to sort of conceptualize that and understand it. And I think, that's important to recognize. It may just be us having an experience that's so different from our conventional reality that we just struggle to acclimate. But over time, based on the results of this study, people do, even though it's culture shock at the highest level. So something I touched on a little bit earlier, and will be more of the focus at the the Cincinnati Symposium, is this aspect of friend or foe. And again, we would expect more friendly interaction with conspecifics. I mentioned the case of Amy Rylance. Her husband and her friend Petra are freaking out. Where's my wife? Well, I saw her go into a UFO. Screw you, that's dumb, that didn't happen. Starts to believe her, call the cops. Cops thinks they murdered her, and then all of a sudden they get a call that Amy is 790 kilometers away, an hour and a half after she disappeared. So that seems to indicate that they were taking care of not just her, but her friend and husband. Also mentioned that same situation with the Corporal Armando Valdez situation. Travis Walton case, obviously, probably all of you here are familiar with that one and probably know him personally. Sees that as an ambulance call, sort of an inadvertent electromagnetic discharge, which required a medical intervention, which is arguably a nice thing to do. Could have shocked him and said, oops, taken off back to their planet. So why? Why care for that individual that was inadvertently harmed? Same thing happened with Mike and Leo Dworshak in that South Dakota case. They were walking up to the ship, and an individual came out, yelling at them, stop, 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 we have to ground the ship. It picks up, they said specifically that picks up a static electricity buildup and could be a Travis Walton thing with two little kids. And then something that's interesting to me was a pattern I didn't really expect to see, but started to recognize in looking at a number of cases and writing this extra tempestural model book, is that they oftentimes use chaperones, and especially with the young children who are part of these, what I would argue are longitudinal studies. So they're picking up these kids, they're studying them throughout their lives. Terry Lovelace, in his book, Incident at Devil's Den, describes the same thing with a woman he referred to as Betty because she looked like Betty Rubble from the Flintstones. Some of you are probably familiar with that one. But he realized, later in life, this is the same woman I've known my entire life. She was there as a kid. There were other kids. We were all playing together, and she was the one taking care of us, essentially, sort of easing that transition, which to kids maybe is easier. I don't know. Kids seem to be more adaptable, more open-minded, except with food and bedtime, I guess. So, this happens throughout these lifelong encounters. But another pattern I noticed that I feel is worth mentioning, and we're getting to the point where we can test these things easily. We can make a testable hypothesis that says, do contactees, are their chaperones more often the same sex or the opposite sex? What I've found, anecdotally at this point, because I've only looked at maybe 6 or 7 cases, is that most often the individual is the opposite sex. But things like these lend themselves to testable hypotheses, ones that can be falsified in the context of large data sets. And I think we should all start thinking about this phenomenon in those terms. What can we learn from doing a content analysis? This isn't just anecdote. Case studies aren't anecdotes. They're potential to learn about what's going on if we look at a number of different cases. Yeah, you go in and cherry pick, that's anecdote. But you can make massive databases and do content analysis and look for patterns across these. And there were a number of these that started to jump out at me as I began doing this. Use of screen memories, UFO apathy, UFO amnesia. There's a lot of cases, again, Terry Lovelace, him and his friend Toby, they see this massive triangular UFO come above them. You see that? Yeah, weird, huh? Yeah, fall asleep. Same with Antonio V.S. Boas. The first UFO he saw, his brother, I think his name was Juan maybe, hey, look at that light. That's weird, huh? Yep, both just go to sleep. So how do they do that? Again, that seems to indicate this highly advanced consciousness that they can manipulate our mind. They can give us these screen memories. They can make us think there were monkeys by our bedside instead of big, scary, big-headed aliens, which doesn't seem to work a lot of the time. Terry Lovelace, again, was like, I hate these monkeys. He wrote a poem about wanting to shoot them. So maybe, they thought they were doing something good. The Disney characters are another one, but, kind of has the reverse effect in some cases. And then the amnesia is a really interesting one because a pattern that I observed is that the valence of the interaction seems to correlate with whether or not the abductee, contactee was allowed to remember the experience. And by that I mean, in cases where there was more trauma involved, there was a lot of screaming and maybe painful procedures, they remembered very little of the interaction. They might have gone in for some regressive hypnotherapy at some point, pulled some of those out. Many people relive those experiences during regression. They start screaming again. They say, no, stop, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go there. I don't want to remember this. But they were made to forget. Whereas, on the flip side of that, you have people that have a great time. They're hanging out with these highly evolved individuals or just very different individuals, regardless of what their origins are, and they report having a good time, or at least, yeah, it's fine, whatever. It was a little weird, but, cool. And they're allowed to remember everything. And I think that's interesting, and again, you have to kind of break that down. Well, why? Why does that pattern exist? And it indicates to me that they're not blanking our memories or washing our memories to help protect their identity. That's sort of the default thought is, well, they don't want us to know who they are or what they did. But so many people tell me they got tours of ships. They sat down and just had conversations with them and were allowed to remember everything. But the ones that really had traumatic experiences are the ones that end up with the screen memories and things. And that seems to indicate to me that they're friendly in that capacity, that they do try to preserve the individual's mentality. A lot of people are arguably and understandably freaked out by these, but if they are able to intervene and sort of scrub those memories. One particular case, I had a 2-hour conversation with this medical doctor recently who was taken about 10 times when he was doing his residency, and he sort of thought something was going on. He started to have these precognitive abilities. He knew his sister was pregnant before she knew. He knew exactly the sex of the baby, the color and shape of a stuffed animal that was in the room that eventually someone walked in right at the end and put that animal there. So he started to have these abilities and began to recognize that this was related to these abduction accounts. And as he became more aware of it and okay with it, he started to remember more and more. It's almost like it was on a timed release, like an Alka-Seltzer or something. But if you look at this across all of these cases, it does seem to indicate that they're doing it for us, not for them, that they are trying to protect us. And that's, again, what we try to do with research subjects. There's all these rules, these laws in place. You have to go through the Institutional Review Board to do any sort of human subjects research. And we're very well aware of that. We know all of those rules in anthropology because we study humans. And it seems to be the same type of things that are happening with regard to these procedures. And even beyond that, there's a number of different cases of healing, people being warned about health problems, and they seek help, and they discover a terminal illness that they were able to avert because of that intervention. Teaching people things, the guided tours, why do that if you're an extraterrestrial? I don't know. Maybe they're just proud of their technology, but it makes more sense if we are them. So what do we get out of it? Obviously, they get a lot of stuff, but what do we get? Looking across various cases, obviously, it's going to expand your view of reality. It is much bigger and more complicated, more interesting, I guess you could argue. Being exposed to this reality that exists far beyond our conventional everyday life. Greater sense of a connection to other people, to this planet. Again, bringing it back to the beginning of this lecture, where that focus on the earth, Mother Earth, the sanctity of this planet is paramount in these interactions. But also other living creatures, empathy for others, not just other people, but other living things. Oftentimes those cognitive abilities, I mentioned the medical doctor who started to have very real and verifiable precognitive views of the future, telepathy, clairvoyance, future knowledge, remote viewing abilities, which many would argue is an aspect of precognition. Eric Wargo's book makes a strong case for that. It's called Time Loops, if anyone's interested. And really being a part of something bigger, something that goes far beyond us as individuals. And one of the cases I highlight in my book, I mentioned a quote from her earlier in this presentation too, a patient named Jerry, where she was arguably subjected to horrific things throughout her entire life. From the beginning of reproductive age all the way through her 20s, 30s, 40s, she claims to have been subjected to forced pregnancies, extractions of fetuses throughout that time. They're using her as a broodmare, essentially. Not that different from what we do with other animals. I grew up on a horse farm, and my dad was an equine practitioner, a veterinarian. He would get eggs shipped from Belgium and sperm from like Secretariat's grandson or whatever, and combine them, stick them in this lame mare, which seemed kind of mean in retrospect. But it's not that different from what's going on here. But why? What does this mean? And what is the trade-off? Is it worth having these violations of human rights in order to achieve whatever end it is that they're trying to achieve? And apparently the answer must be yes. But not everybody, even Jerry, I bring up her case because it's really interesting, where she was subjected to these horrific things, but came to understand it as being more important than her own experience. She says, I think what they're doing is somehow necessary. It has to do, she said, with races, beings, or whatever, coming together to make another creation. This was very important, she said, and as a single person compared to this big, huge thing going on, I should look beyond myself and know that it is for the greater good. I think it's also important to mention that she, like many others, did have those conveyed visions of missiles and war. And so if we take this comment in the context of that interaction, and then the number of other contactees who have received similar downloads and conveyances, it really raises a lot of question about what's going on. What new creation? Who's in charge of that? Should we be worried? I think is the big question. So they obviously get a lot out of these interactions. It does seem to be largely one-sided. I think they get more than we get, especially if they are trying to maintain the future human population because of something that may have gone wrong regarding some things I'll talk about here in a second. But so they obviously get information. There does seem to be a strong sort of ethnographic or biological research component to this. Like I said, what they do is exactly like what I would do as not just a biological anthropologist, but as a linguist, as a culture anthropologist. You don't have to be an archaeologist anymore. Maybe in the future, archaeology gets dropped from anthropology because we can just go back in time. We don't have to dig up the material remains and teeth and fossilized bone. We just go look at living humans who have worldviews and belief systems, and we can finally study those in real time. Study change in Earth's environment and ecology. I talked about that early on in the presentation. Monitoring our nukes, our political, religious relations, institutions, seems to be a common focus as well. But again, without intervention. World War II happened. The Holocaust happened. Rwanda happened. Darfur happened. That was never intervened. So it's about the planet, according to Steve Mera, more than it is about us. We're all mad dogs. And gametes. Gametes, again, seems to be the common tie that binds. And again, why? I won't go into too much detail here, but I talked about a couple reasons in my first book, largely relating to long-term trends in genetic homogenization. We're starting to become one inbred island of Earth. And with time, we start to have inbreeding. It's inevitable. So maybe the main way that you can diversify your gene pool is by sampling groups that have haplotypes, haplogroups that exist in the past, in their past, but don't exist in the future. That's one of a number of things. I'll just highlight these real quick and then wrap it up with this slide. So before European colonialism, which started about 500 years ago, we had all of these different interbreeding populations. There was gene flow among them, but not on a global scale. Once we got into boats, started sailing around, now you have that happening across the entire world. That's sort of the origins of us becoming one population as defined by an isolated interbreeding group. As our technology advanced, as we started to get faster boats and then airplanes and now jets, you can fly across the world and make a baby with somebody in 30 hours. Probably be tired, might need some pills, but you could do it. As we continue to expand our technology, that's likely to happen more and at a faster rate. So there's a lot of problems with having genetic homogenization. You get an increase in homozygous recessive diseases, disorders, and that's an inevitability when you have inbreeding. That's why we don't have inbreeding. It's considered a cultural universal where every human population forbids sexual relations between parent and offspring and siblings. Once you get into cousins, there's some variation there. But we, and even bonobo chimpanzees are always doing it with each other all the time, Once a male gets to be 6 years or older, now they even have the prohibition of those types of sex play and sexual interaction. So we try to avoid it. We have learned to do that because we see that with incest, you get negative traits, and that's a result of an increase in that homozygous recessive diseases that apply. So how do you get around that? Maybe you go back in time and you sample individuals, and this could help explain the family, the lineage aspect of this too, where you sample these haplogroups that don't make it into the future. Now you're getting completely new genetic variants that you can interject into your population. And we do this all the time now with zoo populations. We'll go get genetic material from a panda population here to help diversify this panda population here. We're already doing this as humans the way we manipulate other animals. We may be doing this with ourselves across time as well. We see reduced fertility and fecundity across the world, which is the result of a number of things. 50% reduction in sperm counts in the last 50 years globally across the world. We see this happening even faster in the Western world, where it's a 60% reduction in the last 40 years. That's huge. And if that trend continues, you can only imagine what impact that might have on fertility in the future. There's also something we overlook, is that we help people, which is good for individuals and people who want to have families, but we help people who struggle with fertility to have babies. So we're taking people that, based on natural selection and the principles of evolution, shouldn't be reproducing, but helping them to reproduce. What's that going to do in the future if we continue that? Again, people with families who benefit from the love of children and having a family, but in an evolutionary context, that could be a negative thing. And then we see a trend more recently where people are just choosing not to have kids. That's not regional, it's happening everywhere for various reasons, cost or just lifestyle choice, whatever it is. And that could change. That's probably a diachronic thing, but it's worth mentioning because it has been happening recently. And then what was interesting to me is that as I was just about to publish my first book, I had this whole explanation of this genetic homogenization thing, completely unaware of who Jim Penniston was, the Rendlesham case, and happened to learn about that right before I published it, and read him describing the exact same thing I had independently thought of as a potential reason why they're taking these gametes, and so ubiquitously, that they're having problems with reproduction in their future, and they're coming back to help alleviate those problems by taking sperm and egg from people in the past. There's also potential dangers of us modifying our own genome. Right now, it's illegal to do this with gametic genes. We can do it with somatic cells. You can modify, parts of your body that structure you, but we're not allowed to do it with things that are heritable, that are passed on through sperm and egg. The problem is that this CRISPR technology isn't foolproof. Even if you're messing with somatic cells, there are cases where it gets into your gametic cells, the ones you actually pass down, and could potentially create a lot of problems. Ones that we can't identify, don't know. And maybe at some point, we think we're good enough at it that we apply it to our gametic cells. We try to have perfect babies, designer babies, ones that'll grow up with the exact traits that we want. We'll try to maybe cure diseases, chronic congenital diseases that are passed from parent to offspring, or my guess for where it'll likely start is with age. We're always looking for that fountain of youth. And if we're able to modify our genome to live longer, to fight senescence, this process of biological aging, we're likely to do it. I mean, even if there's laws in place, somebody somewhere is going to start tinkering. And as an interbreeding population, that could be a potential problem. And then the hybridization thing, obviously can't know exactly why that's happening, but in the context of taking sperm and egg, and then how often these hybridized individuals are seen, clearly that's a part of the equation in some way, especially when you consider these massive ectogenesis chambers, external wombs. Terry Lovelace again described that on these large triangular craft, what I started referring to as floating fertility facilities, because they seem to have that specific function and on a large scale. But others have described the same thing, where the process seems to be scaled up, almost a factory-like setting for the extraction of sperm and egg and the development of these hybrids. Again, I don't claim to know why. Maybe we'll know someday. Maybe we'll even know within our lifetime. I never thought I would say that, but it kind of seems like that's a real possibility, which is actually super exciting. If we got to be alive at the time that people have been asking what the hell these things are for tens of thousands of years, we happen to be alive at the time that we all know, that would be pretty cool. So if any of this tickled your fancy, I do have 2, almost 3 books that kind of dive deeper into some of these more nuanced things discussed. The first book has been called Dense. It's more of a scientific approach. Brings in a little bit of UFO stuff, but mostly in the context of a multidisciplinary approach to understanding how this model fits with the extraterrestrial model mostly, and how a time travel interpretation might be the more parsimonious. And then the second book kind of flips that, where it mostly looks at these case studies and then draws some of the science into those cases to see how we might understand them in the context of modern science. And then a book that I just sent to get formatted, which should be out June 1st of this year, sort of takes off all of those science-y chains and is a satirical time travel science fiction novel that also approaches this question of time traveling humans, but in the context of a story that have been told as kind of funny even. So if you like humorous novels, that might be one to look for in June 1st. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again to Stacy for having me. Appreciate your time.